Hello, everyone. My name is Evelyn Farkas. I'm the executive director of the McCain Institute. You can find lots of information about us at mccaininstitute.org. Today, I'm happy to welcome one of our latest authors for our Authors and Insights program. Here at the McCain Institute, we focus on leadership, promoting and preventing democracy and human rights. Dan Runde is the man of the hour, the man to actually help us understand better how development fits into the picture. We do a lot of talking about working with countries on security, on human rights, defending human rights all around the world. But Dan can help us talk a little bit about how we compete in the global world using soft power, using development assistance. So let me introduce Dan. Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. It's awesome to be on your show. I love the McCain Institute. I'm happy to be on this with you, a fellow Greeley graduate. Go Greeley! So I'm happy to be on this yes. Zoom with you. I'm really appreciative.
Dan and I are fellow New Yorkers, and we went to the same high school, so we're proud graduates of Horace Greeley High School. Let me tell you a little bit about Dan. Dan is Senior Vice President and Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also holds the William A. Schreyer Chair in Global Analysis at CSIS. That organization is one of the leading think tanks in Washington, D.C. and around the world. Prior to joining CSIS, Dan held leadership roles at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the World Bank Group. He's also worked as a commercial banker at Citibank in Argentina for many years and as an investment banker. Dan serves on many boards, including the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, where we serve together, the Western NIS Enterprise Fund, Spirit of America, and the Ahezi University Foundation. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bretton Woods Committee. He's a columnist, and most of all, he is an author. He is the author of The American Imperative, which you can see in my hands and behind Dan. And so it is with great pleasure that we welcome you, Dan. I think what we want to know is, why did you write this book? What's the message that you want your readers to come away with?
Thanks, Evelyn. I'm really grateful. I knew John McCain a little bit. I wouldn't say like he was like someone who could kind of totally pick me out of a police lineup. I think he could have vaguely sort of picked me out of a police lineup. I heard him speak at least a dozen times. I held a fundraiser when he ran for Senate in 2016. I brought my whole family. I have a photo with my kids and my wife and John McCain at this fundraiser at Jim Colby's home, a former member of Congress who recently died, who I'm sure was associated with the McCain Institute as well, and was a friend of mine. So I really miss John McCain, and I'm really glad that you are stewarding his legacy at the McCain Institute. I'm so appreciative to be on this in this conversation. So I wrote this book because I've been in Washington for more than 20 years. I lived overseas. I lived in Spain for a while. I lived in Argentina for 3 years. I've been on Wall Street and commercial bank. I was in the Bush administration at USAID, which is the foreign aid arm of the US government. And then I worked at the World Bank Group, which is a big international organization that is involved with international development. And then I've been at a think tank, which is a research institution that works closely with governments around the world, looking at American non-military forms of power. So international foreign aid is one of them, and there are kind of things that are what might describe as foreign aid adjacent that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in what I call on the title of my book, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. It's not a really precise term, but I would argue the reason I wrote this book is unfortunately, we're in a new age. We're not in the post-Cold War age anymore. We're in the post-Cold War age, but that's not really descriptive. So many folks will say it is an age of great power competition. I'm comfortable with that term. There are some that will call it a second Cold War, and we may or may want to talk about that, but I've kind of avoided that term, a second Cold War, though I hear it more and more often. I feel like it has a finality to it and may kind of box us in our options. And so I've been avoiding the term. But let's, for this conversation, say it's an age of great power competition, the competition between democracies, the United States and market democracies in Europe and other parts of the world, and those that are autocracies like China led by the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime in Russia. So in this new age of great power competition, I am all for peace through strength. I think we ought to have a much larger Navy. I think there's a whole series of things in the military realm. But my argument is this, that I think most of this competition is not going to play out in China, and this competition is not going to play out in Russia. Much of it's going to play out, or most, I would argue, is going to play out in Africa, America, the Pacific Islands, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in places like Ukraine and Moldova. And so most of this competition, not all of it, is going to be non-military. It's going to be things like vaccines. It's going to be things like tech standards. It's going to be things like values. It's going to be things like infrastructure. It's going to be things like trade. It's going to be things like who leads the multilateral system. It's going to be about things like education and training. And my message is, if we don't speak to the hopes and aspirations of developing countries and people in the developing world, they can take their business somewhere else. They're going to take their business to China, and in a lot of cases they are. And so we need to wake up and kind of rethink how we engage. So if we believe we're in a new age of great power competition, it's going to play out in the global South, and it's going to play out in a non-military way, then we need a strategy, a strategy that greatly encompasses our non-military forms of our power for this new age. And so I wrote this book to start a national conversation about this. I have views about some of the things we ought to be thinking about, but I'm also interested in engaging. My goal is to engage several 100,000 Americans in the ideas of this book. And so I'm in the yes, I'll stop there.
So before we get to your views on how to fix it, let's just talk a little bit more about the problem. In your book, you mentioned that, you know, we are behind. The United States is behind. There's a lag between the United States and China. That China has been really active in Africa and Latin America. And so my question to you is, can you quickly describe the lag, and then what hope do we have of catching up?
So the first thing I'd say is this is different than 20 years ago. The Chinese Communist Party, and when I say China and I say Russia, I mean the Chinese Communist Party, and I mean Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. So we do not, in theory, have a problem with the Chinese people, and we do not, in theory, have a problem with the Russian people. In fact, we need to find ways to engage the Chinese people. We need to find ways to engage the Russian people. But we have problems with their leaders and their governments. And so we need to find ways to differentiate that. But so I want to waiver for your listeners to say, when I say China or Russia, I need a hall pass, please, in terms of
you got it.
The regime. Okay. So China and Russia can fill voids that 20 years ago they couldn't. Think about COVID. So in the case of COVID, they're able to make things like Sinovac or Sputnik. And so they use that as a weapon, as a diplomatic weapon. There's a whole theory of stuff called vaccine diplomacy. Well, they put vaccine diplomacy on steroids, if I can use that, you know, mixed metaphors or whatever.
Yeah,
they used it as a weapon on things like, we'll give you vaccines if you don't recognize Taiwan in places like the DR. We'll give you vaccines, Dominican Republic, if you include Huawei in your telecom system. And that happened because we could not provide the DR, we could not provide Brazil, we could not provide Guatemala on a timely way, all the top shelf vaccines Pfizer, Moderna, there was only so much to go around. And so we had the TGI Friday strategy. You know, when you go to TGI Fridays, you get one of those buzzers and say, we'll buzz you when your table's ready.
Yeah.
We gave all these developing countries the buzzer saying, we'll buzz you. Hey, hang in there for 12 months. We're taking care of us.
All your people die.
All your people die. Just tough it out. Just tough it out. And we'll give you a buzzer and we'll buzz you when your table's ready with the vaccines. Well, what the heck would you do? And so if Sinovac they got a plane full of Sinovac vaccines and they're crappy on the tarmac, saying, I got a plane full of vaccines, but I've heard this rumor you're not going to recognize Taiwan, and you're going to recognize Taiwan, or I've heard a rumor you're going to not include Huawei in their telecom system. I think you ought to rethink that. They're going to say, I'll do that. That was a thing that happened. So they have that ability. Mainland China is the #1 trading partner today for something like 130 countries. In 1995, we were the #1 trading partner for like 130 countries. That has all sorts of implications as well in terms of whether you can tell somebody to, you know, go take a long walk off of a shore pier, If you look at the way they're using debt, they don't follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules on things like debt in the developing world. There's a big growing problem on debt because people have borrowed money from mainland China in all sorts of funny ways. People know about this port in Sri Lanka, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There have been all sorts of problems creating all sorts of havoc in the global system. As we know, Russia, is willing to involve itself in elections in all sorts of ways, whether it's our elections or other people's elections. The Wagner Group, which you've seen, and they're more of a disruptive power, but that they have the ability as a sidekick of the Chinese Communist Party, to do all sorts of bad things. So I would just say, whether it's also leadership races in the multilateral system, where at one point, they are putting forward mainland China is putting forward very fine candidates to run top shelf UN agencies. And so if they want to run the International Chess and Checkers organization, like, I'm fine with that, but I don't want them running the IMF. I don't want them running like what you might describe as the commanding heights, the important influencer or standard setting bodies of the global system. And so we're in the process, I think, of thinking through like, okay, we need China to engage in the multilateral system, but we don't want them, getting all the top shelf stuff and creating havoc when they do that.
So as you describe in your book, you said sort of while we were sleeping, we weren't paying attention. China made all these deals, in order to get advantages in developing countries, access to ports, access to minerals, influence over whether they would recognize Taiwan or not. And we were just not paying attention. Now we're paying attention. And yes, China did take leadership in some of the multilateral institutions, but all is not lost, right? So what can we do now?
So the good news is, look, there were a lot, I would argue there's a bipartisan consensus today, Evelyn, that we have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party and we have a problem with Russia. What we did have a bipartisan consensus about is what to do about it. So the reason I wrote the book was to say, we need to have a conversation about, okay, how are we going to engage in the multilateral system? So many Republicans are like, that UN stuff, that, they're going to grab my guns, or, they're useless. They don't pay their parking tickets in New York. Like, there's a whole litany of criticisms. And why should I engage with that stuff? Well, if we don't, China will, and will fill the void, and you're not going to like it. So we have to rethink how we engage in the multilateral system because of this. It means things like, okay, we can't go around doing the TGI Friday strategy when there's another pandemic, because China's going to be able to fill a void in ways that they weren't 20 years ago. So my message is, we're not the only game in town anymore. And so we have to up our game, and we have to think about, if we leave voids, these actors have an ability to fill those voids. So we have to have a strategy to respond to that. We have to have a better, in some instances, we have to have a better offer. Sometimes we have to enable a better offer. So we don't have to necessarily compete dollar for dollar with China, but we need to be able to enable an offer. We also need to show up at times and work with our friends and partners in responding to these challenges. And I think the good news is, and Evelyn, I know you're closer to this, Europe really well, is I think Europe is sort of also waking up to the fact they've certainly woken up to the fact they have a problem with Russia. And they are kind of, it strikes me as they're like a step or two behind where we are on China, but are kind of tracking, and kind of their thinking is sort of similar to ours about they have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party as well. So that's the good news. So I think we have to think about things like telecom. Do we really want the digital rails of the future owned by Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay in Africa, Latin America, all over the world? Do we want a series of Pacific Island countries to become, in essence, client states of the Chinese Communist Party because we haven't paid a lot of attention to these places, and they're really far away and they're teeny, but they're also strategically located? And there's a reason why World War II, we had all these battles in the Pacific and these islands that we can hardly find on a map, right? But there's a reason mainland China has an incredible amount of interest in those Pacific Islands. Do we really, the Central Asian countries, some of them not super democratic, are saying we would like to kind of rethink our relationship with the United States, given that we don't like the Russians and we don't want to be at full-on vassal states of the Chinese. How do we take advantage of that? I think there's a jump ball in Central Asia. We may, it's also a region that's really far away, not understood, hard to find on a map. But at the same time, we could have a different kind of a relationship with them. How do we engage with them? And, I think there's an opportunity there. We certainly have to think about what our partnership with Africa looks like. Africa has dozens of African countries today. Their number one trading partner is China. A lot of their borrowing is from China. They get a lot of infrastructure is being built by the Chinese. The telecom systems being provided by China. I'm not sure there's a whole series that, and China sees Africa as a business opportunity. And in theory, we should also be seeing as Africa as a business opportunity. And we're not fully there yet. So I think there's a series of kind of mental shifts we have to make. And then we have to show up with our partners, and we have to understand the challenges in each specific country and how we're going to respond.
So that makes me think about the balance between values, and how do you square the desire to provide assistance? So the value of a humanitarian value, right? You want to help the African countries, developing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and the Pacific with their development from a humanitarian perspective, which is also, of course, in our national interest, as you described. Yet many of these governments are not democratic, and we have also a commitment to, foster human rights and respect for individual rights, and, and democracy where people are interested in democracy, but certainly fundamental human rights. How do you square our interests and our values in the global arena?
So I worry about this because I think it's very important. I do believe that democracy, we ought to be working towards supporting countries to be in an ideal world, some form of a market democracy where everybody's treated fairly and treated with respect, and that the level of corruption is something that's a problem all over the world, is kind of managed. It's sort of like managing cholesterol, like managing those issues. It's not a fixable thing so much as managing it. And so I would say that I think the Biden administration, to their credit, has had these 2 democracy summits and said this is important. They've also been pushing on issues like human rights and corruption. I think these are important issues. I do think this dilemma that you put on the table is a real one. What I worry about, Evelyn, is in this new age where we're going to have more I think we're going to look back on sort of like 1989 through, say, 2015 as sort of a golden age of democracy promotion, a golden age on human rights, a golden age on anti-corruption, because we were not presented with this terrible dilemma. And so I think we're going to have the kinds of challenges where so-and-so is not a democratic actor, but he's our not democratic actor, or he's somebody who's he or she is willing to work with us. Oftentimes it's he, but so I think we need to continue I do think one thing we should be pushing really hard on is the anti-corruption agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
China and Russia do not follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules on things like bribery and grand corruption.
What are those rules?
I think we've said
maybe we're not hanging out with the Marquis.
For 50 years, the U.S. for 80 years, the U.S. and a coalition of the willing has been working towards trying to create a freer, more democratic world. For 80 years, we've been working towards a more humane human rights world through something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For 50 years, the U.S. has led on global changes on anti-corruption work. So democracy, better governance, human rights, anti-corruption. All the improvements have been a result of sort of, because there's this system that was set up after World War II, it's required effort and pushing from a coalition of actors. My view is led by the United States. All the progress in those realms, I would argue, has required U.S. pushing in a specific direction. You now have a set of actors who have gotten much better at being anti-democratic. There's like a whole playbook on being more authoritarian. They trade lessons learned, if you use that term, on being a better authoritarian. But this issue of corruption it's a vote moving issue. If you look at the polling around the world, like this is like a top 3 issue in many developing countries. So we want to be seen as trying to stop and help on corruption issues. This is very important. We also want to make it harder for China and Russia to go around and bribe people willy-nilly. So there's this additional argument. But on the issue of human rights, we're going to have a problem. And we're going to have a problem on democracy because some non-democratic governments are going to say, we want to work with you. But we're also thinking about working with China. Or we're going to need to work with governments for a bunch of other reasons. And their human rights ain't so great. And so we're having to make these difficult trade-offs. And so I would argue we're entering an age of more difficult trade-offs in some of these years. It doesn't mean we should stop, but I do think we're going to have people who will, they'll be, and just like, unfortunately, so this is where it kind of rhymes with the second Cold War, and I don't like the term, but as in the Cold War, there were a series of hard choices and dilemmas of working with certain leaders, whether it was in Africa or Asia and Latin America and elsewhere, even into the post-Soviet space, people like Ceausescu, where we made hard decisions and said, we're going to work with this person, even though we think their values are odious, very offensive to us and disagreeable to us. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to enter this new age where there's going to be a lot more of that. So I think we need to continue to push in that direction. So I generally am in agreement with the Biden administration. I'm pushing on these issues in general. I'm in favor of it, but I do think we're going to be presented with dilemmas. And I think some of the decisions they're going to make or other administrations are going to make, maybe not everyone's going to agree with, but I think it's going to be a challenge that every administration is going to have to grapple with, whether it's this administration or another administration.
So when you look at development, because you're an expert, that most of the work that goes on in that field isn't covered in the newspapers. It's mostly in places like Africa, Asia, Latin America. It's on health care development. It's on economic development. It's on political development. And that's the bread and butter. And that's the main thrust of USAID's work over the years, and the World Bank's work as well. And the World Bank, of course, was very certainly starting after the Cold War, focused on eliminating poverty. But in the United States, when we start discussing development, oftentimes in the political arena here in Washington, D.C., the conversation gets a little bit distorted by some of the high profile cases, which aren't necessarily the ones where most of the money and effort is going, but I want to talk to you about some of them. So there's Ukraine, which is right now receiving a lot of development assistance from the United States. And when the war ends, which it will eventually, we'll also get more assistance. And there's a lot at stake here for the United States. Can you just talk quickly about why you think Ukraine is important, why we can't get it wrong? And then if I can ask you also, I'll just give you my next question, which is, how do we avoid making the mistakes we made in Afghanistan, where we weren't able to clamp down on corruption? And frankly, a lot of people looking back at that think that we didn't do the best job, putting our development money to work in Afghanistan.
Okay. So Ukraine matters, and is worthy of our support for several reasons. One is that the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom and for their country. They really want it, and they're putting people forward, and they're asking for material support, and there's large sustained support throughout Ukraine to remain an independent country, and they want to be an independent country, and they want to join the European Union, and they want to join NATO. So if you look at the polling, that's clear. Second, what happens in Ukraine isn't going to stay in Ukraine. And so second, so the Russians, if people think, oh, if we can just quote unquote, figure this out in Ukraine in favor of the Russians, that somehow we're going to appease this monster, we're all kidding ourselves. He's got designs on the Baltic states. He's got designs on Moldova. He's got designs on Poland. He's got designs on Kazakhstan. He wants to reconstitute a Putin-led Soviet Union 2.0. Basically, that's what he wants. You could say it's a Russian Empire, but this is a bad dude. This is not somebody who's going to basically say, that this is, this is not, and it would be wrong to appease somebody who's done this. But second, if anyone thinks this is somehow going to go away if we sort of appease him in this way, that's not true. Third, Xi Jinping is watching, And Xi Jinping is hoping that Russia gets away with it. They're financing the war effort of Russia. They are
By
betraying.
buying their natural resources.
Yeah, they're buying, right. They're
The gas.
buying all the gas from Russia. They are betraying. I could use stronger language, but since this is a family podcast, I'm going to go with betraying. They're betraying the Ukrainians in the United Nations by watering down important votes, statements. They're betraying the Ukrainians in the G20 by watering down important statements. They are 100% on team China, team Russia. They want the Russians to win. Anybody who says otherwise is wrong. It's not true. And the reason they want Russia to win is because if Russia is able to get away with this at an acceptable enough cost, that will embolden Xi Jinping to say, oh, well, maybe I can go do Taiwan.
Right.
So this is not just about Ukraine. This is about values. It's about rules. It's about people saying, I want to be free. But it's also about this wolf at the door in Europe, in Russia. But it's also about Xi Jinping rubbing his hands together and saying, I really hope I'm on team. He wears a T-shirt saying Team Russia, and he, I don't know who he's not, doesn't believe in God, so I don't know who he prays to or what he prays to, but he's got, he is hoping, and whatever he does, that Russia wins because it will embolden him and his cause to invade Taiwan. And so
okay,
sorry.
So just in the interest of time, because we are running low, how do we avoid the mistakes we made in Afghanistan in the context of Ukraine?
So the first thing I would say is that there's a lot more. It seems as if there's a lot more skin in the game by Ukrainians, in the sense that you've got enormous numbers of Ukrainians who are willing to fight for this cause. And you look at the polling; it's very high in favor of the government. They consider the Zelensky government legitimate. The polling in terms of where the country wants to go, it's not as divided a society. It was a divided society 15 years ago. It is not a divided society anymore. This society wants to be free, it wants to be independent, it wants to be part of NATO, and it's part of the European, and it is a country in Europe. It's a European country. They want to join the European Union. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what I say to people is, what would you have done to join the coolest fraternity or the coolest sorority in college? That is what it's like joining the European Union. And for American audiences, what the hell is this European Union thing? This is like the cool kids club. So there's hazing that's involved with this. There's not enough foreign aid. There's not enough white papers at think tanks. There's not enough seminars. There's not enough lectures by diplomats. What will change the behavior of the electorate of Ukraine, what will change the behavior of the political class in Ukraine, what will change the behavior of the business class in Ukraine, is the enormous carrot of joining the coolest fraternity or sorority in the world, the European Union. And
the rules that you have to, the criteria you have to meet.
The hazing. You have to do a whole bunch of stuff. And so what's going to pull, we need to align all of our reconstruction and all the reform stuff in line with EU accession. And so Europeans will tell you, and I know you talked to a lot of high-level Europeans, Evelyn, because you know Europe well, and they've kind of Euro-splain us Americans on this. And it's like, oh, it's so complicated, and you have to reform the blah, blah. And so they have not been formally invited, as you know, Evelyn. They've been kind of given a save the date, but they haven't been a formal invitation. So my deepest thought, because we're doing a lot in Ukraine reconstruction, is you got to send them a real invite to the wedding. If I'm mixing lots of metaphors here, but you know what I mean? Like, they need to be join the fraternity, or join the, whatever you call that. What is it? Rush. We want you to pledge. We want you to pledge this fraternity or sorority. That's what we want.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I would just say that the second thing is there is a lot of discussion about when we may need, this is a very inside Washington discussion, we may need a special inspector general for Ukraine. I'm opposed to that. And I'm opposed to that because starting 10 years ago in the Obama administration, there was a rethink about saying we're going to empower, there was a special institutions at the AID, State Department, Department of Defense, called inspector generals.
That's right.
We'll have big forces of folks. The special inspector general for Afghanistan had more inspector general staff than the entire Inspector General staff of USAID. That's crazy. And then you couldn't close it down. And it's still operating. We've been out of Afghanistan for 2 years. There are several hundred people, I'm not sure doing what. And I know what they're looking to do is they're looking to turn the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan's staff, and they're looking for a new mission, into the new Special Inspector General for Ukraine. You care about big government. So if you're a Republican and say, well, there's too much government, why would you let a new run amok bureaucracy be stood up when you have plenty of bureaucrats who can do this job already? So I'm against a Special Inspector General. We should sunset the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan because we're not fully there anymore. And second, we should not have a Special Inspector General for Ukraine. So again, sorry, listeners who are not inside the Beltway. I know that's a super duper inside baseball thing, but it actually does matter in terms of how we support. But ultimately aligning, so ultimately what we want, Evelyn, is I think that we can see what success looks. I can tell you what success looks like in Ukraine. I couldn't really tell you what success really looked like in Afghanistan, but success in Ukraine looks as follows. Fully a member of the European Union, the GNP per capita of Poland, it's 1/4 the GNP per capita of Poland. It's the same size and kind of has the same kind of geography and makeup.
And under communism, they were actually wealthier, but keep going.
Yeah, the tech oomph of Estonia, the manufacturing oomph of Germany, the agricultural potential of Canada, and the defense industrial base of Israel. So nobody ever messes with them ever again. Now you're closer to this than I am, Evelyn, but I never hear the Russians say, man, I think I'm going to go invade Finland. Now, you know why? Because in 1939, they had their teeth kicked in by the Finns. So what we want is for the Russians after this say, oh man, that was such a horrible thing that I'm going to take a timeout for 100 years.
Yeah.
Trying to invade Ukraine because that was horrible. That's what we want. We want them to feel the same way they feel about Finland. Like, I may want Finland, I may want Ukraine, because if you give them a couple of shots of vodka, they'll say, oh, I really would like to have Finland back, or I'd really like to have Kiev. Well, that's crazy.
For the listeners, Finland used to be part of the Russian Empire for a while.
Right. So the point is like, we want them to be like, I'm taking a 100-year time out on having a simple thought about trying to invade Ukraine after this. We want to, but we need Ukraine to be strong enough to they won't be messed with. All
right. This is fantastic, Dan. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But what I want to tell you is I actually think we have a fair amount of wonky listeners, viewers who understand that it's not just the esoteric arguments that matter. It's the process, it's the procedure. You have that experience. You're a smart man, but you've also served in all kinds of international and national organizations, understanding how this all works, how the rubber hits the road, to use an analogy that you didn't use. So with this, I invite everyone to go to TGI Fridays, pledge your fraternity.
Right?
Pledge your fraternity. Get your COVID shots. Let's see, what other analogies am I missing? Get invited to a wedding, and really go out and buy The American Imperative. This is a great book, imperative rather. It will give you really good insights. It's a great summary also of how we fell behind, and then obviously gives you some motivation to support American development and the soft power tools that we have in our toolbox.
Evelyn, I'm ultimately guardedly optimistic. I think we need a bipartisan consensus like we had in the early Cold War on what to do about it. I think we'll get there. And I think part of the 2024 election process will be about trying to debate and think through what we're going to do as a country on this. I think some of the stuff that's happening with the Select Committee of China is helping on this. I think many of the things that the Biden administration are doing are really helpful in this way as well. So I remain guardedly optimistic. So please go out. I hope folks will go out and read The American Imperative. I really appreciate the McCain Institute hosting me. Thank you, Evelyn. It's great to see you on the screen. Go Greeley, as I said at the beginning. And thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Super. Thank you, Dan. Take care. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute. For more information on the work that we do to defend democracy, human rights, and to create character-driven leaders, please go to our website, McCainInstitute.org. We'd love to have you sign up, come to our events, get on our mailing list. Thanks again.